Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a specific conservative Islamic perspective on the challenges and choices facing Muslim women in our contemporary world. So what really defines a woman's identity today? Well, the sources we're digging into frame this as a kind of tug of war, a real tension between traditional faith and the constant pressures of modern life.
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start by looking at the core problem as the author sees it, then we'll get into the consequences, and finally, explore the path forward that's being proposed for women.
Okay, let's jump right in. The source material frames the central issue as something called an ideological invasion, or in Arabic, al-Ghazwa al-Fikri, and it argues this invasion originates from the West. Now get this, according to the author, this kind of invasion is way more dangerous than any military conquest. Why? Because it doesn't target land or resources, it targets the very minds and beliefs of the community, especially the younger generation.
So the source argues these ideas don't just pop up out of thin air. It points to some very specific channels, things like foreign schools, Western media, secular philosophies, that from this viewpoint all work together to create a gap between a young person and their own Islamic roots.
So what happens when this invasion takes hold? Well, according to the text, the first major result is a crisis of identity. And it says the most obvious symbol of this is the changing attitude toward the hijab.
The source uses a specific term for this, tabarruj. And it's not just about, a lack of covering. It's defined as a particular kind of self-display that's considered forbidden by religious texts. That distinction is pretty key to understanding this whole perspective.
And you can see right away how this idea of modesty goes way beyond just clothes. We're talking about an entire approach to how you act, how you speak, and how you interact with others in public.
To really drive the point home, the author presents this powerful historical example of the women of the Ansar. They're held up as the absolute ideal, a model of immediate, unquestioning obedience that sets a really high standard.
Okay, so we've talked about the outward stuff. But the text argues this ideological shift creates a kind of internal void too. The idea is that fundamental religious and cultural knowledge is getting pushed aside for more, superficial concerns.
A huge part of the argument here is about role models. The source is basically asking, who are we looking up to? It claims that foundational female figures from Islamic history, we're talking scholars, leaders, entrepreneurs, are being replaced in the minds of young people by today's celebrities.
And the source actually tries to back this up with some numbers. It points to this survey of university students which found a pretty shocking gap between how much they knew about general topics like sports and pop culture versus their knowledge of their own religious history.
And if that wasn't clear enough, get this. Another study mentioned in the text gave a group of young people in Kuwait a list of 32 different figures, both historical and modern. Out of that whole list, the number they could all recognize was just one. And who was it? A pop singer.
Okay, so we've heard the problem, we've seen the consequences, so where does the author say the solution is? It's a path the source calls rectification.
Now this is really the heart of the proposed solution. It's not about making a few small changes here and there. The source is advocating for a complete, conscious recentering of your entire life around Islamic principles as the author understands them.
Now this is a big one. The author really pushes back against the idea that the domestic role is some kind of prison. Instead, it's framed as a woman's most important, most impactful contribution to her society and her faith. And it emphasizes that this role, raising the next generation, is seen as equal in spiritual reward to a man's public duties. And to give that idea some serious religious backing, the text uses this quote. The point is to show that a woman's work in the home isn't seen as secondary at all, but as its own parallel path to achieving the highest spiritual rewards. Okay, for our last section, we're making a bit of a pivot. We're moving from a defensive stance to something much more proactive. The second source text actually outlines a really powerful role for women in community leadership and education. The source material is super clear on this. It argues that even if men and women have different societal roles, this core responsibility to educate and share the faith is universal. It's for everyone.
So from this perspective, women aren't just participants in outreach, they're absolutely essential leaders. The text gives several strategic reasons why. They have unique access to other women, they have a deeper understanding of women's issues, and of course they have an unparalleled influence on the next generation. However, and this is an important however,
This active public role is framed within a very specific set of religious guidelines. From the author's viewpoint, these rules, everything from proper hijab to needing a guardian's permission, are there to safeguard a woman's dignity and prevent what's seen as social chaos.
So when you put it all together, what's the big picture? Well, the perspective being presented in these sources isn't one of passive women hiding away at home. It's actually a vision of purposeful, guided engagement in both the family and the wider community.
So we've just spent this whole explainer walking through one conservative viewpoint that champions tradition as the anchor in a world that's changing at lightning speed. And that leaves us with a much bigger, more universal question. In our hyper-connected world, how can any community, any person, strike that balance between preserving the traditions they hold dear and adapting to the undeniable forces of globalization?